This is my first video update coming to you from Nicosia, Cyprus. Let's talk about what's going on in the world today on this Saturday morning. And let's begin with what's happening in Ukraine and the situation in Ukraine. And the first thing that I want to talk about with regards to Ukraine and the military situation in Ukraine is that in Donetsk, in the south of Donbass, the Russian army, the Wagner group, they're making significant progress in Donetsk, in the Donetsk area. And I talked about the fact that the town of Kodema had been taken by Wagner, had been liberated, and now they're moving towards Soledar, and Bakhmut is next. Very, very important city of Bakhmut, area of Bakhmut. That is now. After Soledar, it looks like that'll be the next focus for Wagner, and a lot of progress is being made in this area, and not many people are talking about it. You know, I mean, media, a lot of the media, they're not talking about it because all the attention was at one point focused on Kherson, the great Kherson counteroffensive, which fizzled out and failed, and now all the attention, rightly or wrongly so, is focused on Kharkov and Izyum and this area, and the fighting in Donetsk and Donbass, the South Donbass, is moving forward, and the Russians are making progress, and the Wagner guys, I mean, they're making significant progress, it seems. So my point in saying this is just to make a note, I guess, to myself, in a way, to kind of remind myself that the main operation for the Russians, the important operation in Donetsk, is still moving according to their schedule and to their plans, and they haven't been thrown off course. And the distractions that have taken place in other areas, Kherson and Kharkov, have drawn away our attention from Donetsk, and they have distracted much of the attention away from the main theater of battle for the Russians. But progress is being made. A lot of progress is being made, it seems. So. And that's the important part of the special military operation. So I thought I would just mention that very, very quickly. And let's now focus on what has most of the media attention and the analyst attention, which is Kharkov and Izyum, Balakleya and the Izyum area, and all of this. And one sec. And so I think you have three narratives that have formed around Izyum, Balakleya, Izyum, Kharkov Oblast, this counteroffensive. I'm going to give three very simple narratives. I know there's a lot more detail to things, and there's a lot more nuance. I understand that, but I'm going to give what I think are the three main narratives. The first narrative is that Ukraine, they mounted a successful counteroffensive in Kherson, in Kharkov, and they're going to continue to push forward and continue to advance, and eventually they are going to take Izyum. They're going to surround Izyum, and they're going to push the Russians out of Izyum. That is the first narrative. That, I believe, is the most unlikely narrative, in my opinion. I think that's going to be very, very unlikely, but it is one of the narratives out there. So we have to throw that out there. And as I get into some of the analysis that I'm going to read, I think it'll explain why this outcome is perhaps the least likely outcome. I mean, the Russians would have to monumentally mess up on multiple levels in order for this outcome to occur. But it is one of the narratives. It is one of the general narratives that is out there, and it's probably it probably is the narrative that the Western collective West mainstream media is pushing the most for various PR and optics reasons. So they are pushing this narrative of a successful counteroffensive from the Ukraine military, hence more money, more weapons, everything is going great. People in Europe don't get out on the streets and protest. The Putin government is going to fall any minute now, and all the money and weapons and everything and support that we've given to Ukraine is paying dividends. And okay, you can see why the collective West media is going to champion and push this scenario. The other two narratives are that this is a trap, that the Russian military, they knew all along that this counteroffensive in Kharkov was going to happen. And so they allowed this salient to form. They allowed this advance to take place, an advance which was largely uncontested. And now they've got the Ukraine military right where they want them. They've drawn them out of forested areas. They've drawn them out of fortifications. And now they've got these 9,000 troops, which is the number that is thrown around often. 9,000 Ukrainian military involved in this counteroffensive. Now the Russians have them, and they've brought in reinforcements, and the trap is going to be sprung. And these troops now are going to be, these Ukrainian troops, they're going to be annihilated. In other words, this is what the Russians were planning all along. And the third narrative is that this was indeed a mishap. This was an error on the part of the Russian military. They kind of took their eye off the ball there, and I'll explain why. Many people say this is a likely scenario. The Russians have these areas thinly fortified. They don't have a lot of forces in areas like Balakleya and these areas, and this was exploited by NATO. NATO surveillance. They exploited this weakness. They saw there was a weakness there, and they capitalized on it. But now the Russians, they've adjusted very, very quickly, and reinforcements are coming in, and the end result will very much mirror the end result of the second scenario, the trap scenario, in that the Ukraine advance is once again trapped. They advanced too far. They don't have the supply lines. They don't have the ability to advance further. They don't have the ability to hold this territory and to reinforce these gains. And now the Russians have indeed moved in, and they've brought in their reinforcements. And the end result will be a trap being sprung, and the Ukraine military out in the open and susceptible to the Russian firepower, the artillery and the air support. So those, I believe, are, generally speaking, I want to be very clear here, generally speaking. I know there's a lot of nuance to all of this and a lot of detail to all of this, but I think in general, those are the three narratives and scenarios that everyone has been talking about over the past couple of days. Let me read you two articles, two statements, one statement and one article. And the first one is the trap scenario, that this was deliberate. This was planned all along by the Russians, and the Ukrainians, they fell for it, and they advanced into this area. They created the salient, and the Russians now, they've got the reinforcements in place, and the trap is going to be sprung. So let me just get to this message here. And it has to do with a statement attributed to Abdi Alaudinov, who was the who was the commander of the Akhmat regiment. And he says in his statement, Mr. Alaudinov, he says that what is happening today was planned. It is a tactical ploy which helped us to pull all their forces, the Ukraine military forces, and means into the territory where it is convenient for us to fight them. If anyone thinks that the Russian leadership, the MOD, the Ministry of Defense leadership, was unaware that the enemy was gathering forces, then those people understand nothing about politics or the military. The speed of the Russian reinforcements that have come to this area, no doubt this order, or most likely this order, would have been given, maybe even as much as a week in advance in order to prepare for these reinforcements to move into this area, because as with all things, you have a lot of bureaucratic processes and red tape and stuff like that taking place. So perhaps the Russians, this really was a trap. Perhaps the Russians had given the order a week ago to get the reinforcements ready for when Ukraine does make this push deep into Russian held territory in Izyum, and then get these reinforcements moving. So that's an excellent analysis and a very possible scenario. And I can see that. I can see the thinking that the Russian military, they were in the Vostok, they were doing all of these, participating in all these events and the Economic Forum and all these events in the Far East, and they made it appear like their guard was down, and NATO, with its surveillance, they saw a weakness in this Balakleya area, and they decided to push forward. NATO obviously wanted to show a successful counteroffensive, as we've explained many times, given the Ramstein Air Base meeting and all of these things that were taking place, Blinken's visit to Kiev. They had a certain timeline that they wanted to show a success. And so the Russians, knowing all of this, they laid the trap, and they set the trap, and NATO and the Ukraine military, they walked right into it. And the reinforcements were ready and waiting, and they got the go-ahead, and now they're in place, and they're going to start rolling back these gains. So that's one narrative, and I think that's an excellent narrative. Let me give you the second narrative, the third, which is, let me read you the second statement, the second analysis, which is focused on the third scenario and narrative that I talked about in my video intro. And this has to do with a Substack post, once again, that Larry sent me. And this is a fantastic analysis of the Kharkov quote-unquote counteroffensive. Let's just call it that, for lack of a better word. And this is coming from the Substack. Let me read it here. BigSerge.substack.com. BigSerge.substack.com. And I will put a link to this down below, because it's it's not too long of an article, but it is too long for me to read it in this video. But I will put a link to this down below, and I think this is an excellent analysis as to not only what took place in Balakleya and this Kharkov Oblast in Izyum, but also what needs to happen now going forward for Russia. A fantastic analysis. And I'm swatting away at like mosquitoes, just like a ton of mosquitoes and flies and bugs, and just, this is Cyprus. This is what life is like on an island. Anyway, I'm going to go further down in this article, because I've highlighted some interesting points, but I recommend reading this for anyone that's interested to get an understanding as to what's happening in Izyum, and maybe an alternative understanding as to what's happening in Izyum. And I think this is a fantastic analysis, and the most likely scenario that happened with regards to this Kharkov counteroffensive. So towards the end of the article, I'm going to read quite a bit here, but this is what Big Serge.substack says. Let's see here. This is a salient with Ukrainians inside. In short, the Ukrainian advance has been too slow and lacks a clear path to reach operational objectives. Already, Russia has begun to deploy huge reserves to this theater, and fear is beginning to show among the more operationally aware Ukrainians. One Ukrainian journalist at the front had this to say: "There is heavy fighting near Kupiansk, worse than Balakleski. We are taking heavy losses." This is a Ukrainian journalist. "We are taking heavy losses. The enemy is transferring a bunch of reserves by air. The Wagnerites have already arrived in the city itself. The sky is filled with aircraft. Hearing about all this, a haunting feeling of an ambush arises in the soul. What if this really turns out to be a strategic level ambush?" Now, that was the quote from a Ukrainian journalist. Further on in this article, it says, "I do not believe that this is an ambush per se by the Russian army. The word ambush implies that the Russian forces were already in position, drawing the Ukrainians into a specific maneuver plan where they could be attacked from prepared positions. That's not what's happening at all. Russian forces are coming in fresh from reserve and were not pre-deployed to the sector. What the operation reflects instead is Russia's preference to wage a high firepower mobile defense. Frontline positions are, relatively speaking, thinly manned." Let me read that again. "Frontline positions are, relatively speaking, thinly manned, which powerful mobile reserves are held back. This is a flexible firefighting approach which allows the Ukrainians to advance into a vulnerable position so that they can be destroyed. For Ukraine, one of the basic problems is that Russia has such an enormous advantage in firepower, aircraft, tube artillery, rocketry, and tanks, that any offensive must reach operational depth quickly in order to disrupt Russia's ability to bring this firepower to bear. In the Izyum sector, this simply isn't possible. Lacking the ability to operationally compromise Russian forces here, Ukraine will find itself in a good old-fashioned shootout against an enemy with vastly superior firepower. Not only that, but it is in fact Ukraine that now faces operational complications, having blasted their way into a salient with no prospects for crossing the Oskil in force and exploiting." By the way, that sound that you hear is like this little fountain over there. I hope it's not too distracting. I didn't think about it when I sat down here, that this fountain was going to be turned on. So I think that's an excellent explanation. And there's no doubt about it that these areas, like Balakleya, are thinly manned. I think there's no doubt about that. And I think there's no doubt that that NATO surveillance, they saw that this was a vulnerability, specifically in this area. And they moved the Ukraine proxy army to attack it. But the explanation that Russia is... They've got their reserves ready to spring into action because they're fighting a mobile war is also very correct. So what happens now, according to this article? What happens now? It seems probable to me that Ukraine's advance has reached or is nearing its culmination. As Russian reserves flood into the area, Russian missile strikes attack the Ukrainian command post in Chugiev, and Russian aviation and artillery begin to lay it on thick. The choice Ukraine now faces is whether to continue to funnel forces into the salient that they have created for themselves. In other words, Ukraine now gets to decide the scale of its losses. According to Ukrainian insider channels, they are currently planning to double down and feed more reserves in, promising a correspondingly larger defeat. I don't like to make concrete predictions about dates or casualty numbers. There are far too many unknowns for anyone to actually think they can predict such specifics. But regarding the general trajectory, I am confident predicting that Ukraine's offensive is nearing the high water mark and will soon become a mass casualty event for the Ukrainian army. It may take a few more days for the situation to stabilize entirely, but that point is rapidly approaching and many of Ukraine's best units face destruction. However, I would be remiss if I did not make an appropriate critique of Russia's conduct of this operation. There are still important lessons to be learned. This is the important part. And I really, really like this analysis, by the way. This is the important part because he lays out what Russia needs to do now, given the fact that this thinly manned area was indeed exploited by NATO and the Ukraine military. The Russians quickly made adjustments, and they're bringing things back to an acceptable level, back to where they were. But you know, there are lessons to be learned here. So let's continue. Further conduct of the war. While the actual counteroffensive is continuing into a catastrophe for Ukraine, the fact that they were able to launch this operation at all has important implications, specifically in regards to Ukrainian manpower. Russia has been fighting an economy of force operation that aims to destroy the Ukrainian army through attrition. Ukraine's ability to launch two counteroffensives, Kherson and Pre-Izyum, Kharkov in other words, suggests two important reasons to modify Russia's force deployment. Number one, the deficiency of tripwire defenses. Many sectors of Russia's front are thinly manned, with forces being held in reserve to wage a mobile defense. The actual troops at the front amount to a string of token forces who are there primarily to try to slow the enemy with reserves, while reserves are brought forward. While holding a mobile reserve is the correct approach, given the force deployment that Russia has made, this is problematic because it allows the Ukrainians to make temporary gains. In an operational sense, this isn't a catastrophe. Russia has the firepower and mobility to crush these offensives. The problem is that it allows Ukraine to temporarily retake settlements, which exposes civilians in these areas to reprisal killings such as occurred in that town in Ukraine, that village in Ukraine, that something happened a couple of months ago, which I can't really name because of the YouTube algorithms, but you can see it on the screen there. In the current example, we can look at Balakleya. In and of itself, these cities do not have major operational value, but it does have Russian civilians in it who would be exposed to Ukrainian revenge if the city was temporarily recaptured. Russia must reconsider its force deployments so that it can more firmly hold settlements at the front line for the sake of these civilians. That is what we said in our analysis at the Duran yesterday. That's what I said in my update yesterday as well. The optics of Russia not being able to hold territory it controls is an issue, because Russia needs to show that when it takes territory, when it really takes territory, really decides to hold territory, it does indeed hold it. That's very important for morale as well as for what the Ukrainian civilians go through. So that's very, very important. And of course, the optics in general inside of Russia and in Ukraine, that civilians, once they're under Russian administration, that they're safe. You need to, those optics need to hold true. They need to stay in place. And so I completely agree with this analysis. The second point that this article is making, Ukrainian force generation. Ukraine's meta strategy so far is predicated on a two-tier army. The lower tier consists of poorly trained cannon fodder who man defensive belts and slow down the Russian army with their bodies by forcing an exchange of artillery shells for their lives. This is the army that Russia is attriting at horrific loss ratios in the Donbass. The first tier Ukrainian army are the forces that are being trained and equipped by Western handlers. The Ukrainian scheme is to delay Russia by trading their conscript cannon fodder while they assemble the first-tier forces for counteroffensives. Ukraine has demonstrated that even if they haven't completely competently used their first-tier forces, they still have the capability to assemble real strike packages with Western help, so long as the lower-tier army is able to buy time. This calls into question the Russian strategy of attrition because it means that Russia is attriting soldiers that Ukraine doesn't care about. It is probably unwise to allow the West to build yet another army in the rear for yet another wave of counteroffensives. Russia should evaluate ways to deny Ukraine access to its manpower pool and raise its force deployment to that effect. Nikolaev, Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporozhye, Odessa, and Kharkov must be taken from Ukraine to that end. And the Russian army must become serious about destroying Ukrainian infrastructure and logistics to prevent Ukraine from continuing the buildup of first-tier forces in the rear. Russia continues to attempt to win the war with a light head, bare minimum force deployment and precision strikes, sparing critical infrastructure, while the defeat of the current counteroffensives demonstrates that it is still well on the path to victory. The mere existence of these counteroffensives suggests that Russia must raise its force deployment, taking advantage of its significant powers of force generation, and deny Ukraine access to its population pools, or else victory may well be slower and more costly than necessary. So that was quite a bit of reading that I did. I don't usually do that much reading, and I apologize for that, because usually the walking around and the talking, it's always good to see the areas that I'm walking around as we're discussing things. But I think this is a fantastic analysis. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. And I think this Substack post really nails it on multiple levels. I think it explains properly what happened in Balakleya, Kharkov, Izyum. And I think it also explains what needs to happen now going forward, and how Ukraine is fighting this war, how Russia is fighting this war, and how while a Russian victory is I don't want to say certain, but is the most likely outcome, right? How quickly that outcome is achieved depends on the adjustments that Russia makes, and I've always said the slower Russia goes, the quicker the economies of the collective West collapse. But on the flip side to that, the slower Russia goes, the more of an opening you give to NATO to perhaps exploit certain gaps or certain miscalculations, and to inflict damage, and to perhaps even turn the tide to a certain extent. You know, the slower you go, the more opportunity you give to your enemy on the battlefield. So let me think here. Let me get to my clown world, and I'll try to do a second update and talk about the travel ban and some other stories. But let me just get to my clown world and wrap up this video. And I just want to say that NATO and the collective West, they're very good at the PR stuff and the soft power, the media soft power. I mean, that's their huge advantage in all of this, is their media soft power, and they are using their media soft power to push the narrative that this was a huge win for the Zelensky regime and for Ukraine, and thus the collective West needs to stick it out longer in Ukraine. You know, no one should pull out of Ukraine. No EU country now should think about pulling out of Ukraine, because Zelensky did manage to put together what the collective West is calling a successful counteroffensive, and you're seeing it in statements from Lloyd Austin at the Pentagon and various other articles, which are saying Ukrainian counteroffensive had, Lloyd Austin said, some success. And he goes on to say, we see success in Kherson now, we see some success in Kharkov, and so that is very, very encouraging. This is what he told reporters on Friday during a press conference in Prague. And he just went on to say that, let me see here. Yeah, he went on to say that specifically Kharkov, he was specifically focusing on Kharkov, that, we're seeing success and we're encouraged. That was pretty much the gist of Lloyd Austin's statements. So, you're going to see this now. You're going to see the collective West use what has happened in Kharkov as a way to keep specifically the Europeans, the EU countries, to keep them invested in the Ukraine project, because it's the EU countries that are having their economies collapse. And so as their economies collapse, they're the ones that are saying, we don't want any more of this Ukraine stuff. So here's Lloyd Austin and the Pentagon and Blinken coming along and saying, here's some money, and take a look at what Zelensky has done. This is encouraging, so don't bail out just yet. That's the message. Don't bail out just yet. We are seeing success now. That's going to be their message to extend the conflict. And even Ukraine is using what has happened in Kharkov for their own PR purposes, and they're saying that they're going to retake Crimea in a year. And this is not Ukraine, actually. My apologies. This is a U.S. general. A U.S. general is using what is happening in Kharkov, and he's spinning it to say that Ukraine is going to retake Crimea in a year, and he is asking for more weapons, more money, and more weapons. Actually, he's even asking for the Biden White House to not even put a price tag on the money and the weapons that they're giving to Ukraine. Don't put a price like $50 billion. Don't put a budget on it. Just keep it open. Open up a tab like you're at a bar and you open up a tab at the bar. That's what he's saying. Just, keep it open and just keep on funneling money and weapons. This is what, wow. I always walk to the noisy areas. This is what this ex-U.S. general said. Ben Hodges, he told Newsweek on Thursday that the Ukrainians saved their country, declaring that half a year after the start of the full-scale Russian invasion, the supposed second-best army in the world is now the second-best army in Ukraine, with Russia's ability to conduct further offensive operations all but exhausted. And he said that Washington should stop publicizing the cost of the military aid it sends overseas. And he's suggesting the deliveries be framed in terms of the percentage of what is needed for Ukraine to defeat Russia and regain their territory. The retired general did not elaborate on how those numbers could be calculated. But the administration of U.S. President Joe Biden has poured over $44 billion into the war effort since February. Okay. And then you have Ukrainian MP Alexei Goncharenko. He echoed Hodges' optimism in comments to Newsweek, declaring that next year will be the decisive year of the war and that with the help of the free world, Ukraine has an opportunity to win. That will require a lot more weapons. He clarified, mentioning aircraft, air defense systems, and rockets superior to the HIMARS. And they later claim that that Ukraine could restore full sovereignty within a year, retaking all of its territory, including Crimea, according to the U.S. General Ben Hodges. So this counteroffensive from Ukraine is going to be exploited on a media, PR, funding, aid, military equipment basis. That's obviously what it's going to be used for. Even though I'm very confident, the Duran is very confident. The analysis that I just read you is very confident that that Russia within a week or two, or maybe even sooner, is going to roll back all these advances, all these gains. The narrative, though, has already been pushed out there, and I'm sure that the collective West is already lining up the money and the weapons, and they're already getting everything on board to give it over to Ukraine and to Zelensky. So let's do a clown world and we'll wrap this up. And this clown world is coming from Germany. And this is a good one, actually. And I don't even know if it's that much of a clown world. Maybe it's more of a warning from a German MP to get rid of the 3 clowns that are destroying Germany: Scholz, Habeck, and Annalena Baerbock. German government's the stupidest in Europe for managing to embroil itself in a full-blown economic war with a top energy supplier, Russia, according to left-wing politician Sahra Wagenknecht. That is what she said on Thursday. Now, she's quite an interesting politician. I've followed many of her statements in the past, and she's pretty spot on. Sahra Wagenknecht, and I'm sure I'm pronouncing that name incorrectly, but she's made comments in the past which I found very interesting, very precise. But she's saying that the German government is the dumbest government in Europe. And let me find some of her quotes here. Speaking in the Bundestag, the former co-chair of the party Die Linke urged an end to the anti-Russian sanctions and the resignation of the country's vice chancellor and economy minister Robert Habeck. While describing the ongoing conflict in Ukraine as a crime, Wagenknecht said, "The anti-Russian sanctions are fatal for Germany itself. With energy prices out of control, the country's economy will soon just be a reminder of the good old days," the MP warned, as she urged canceling the restrictions and engaging in talks with Russia. "We really have the stupidest government in Europe," she told the parliament, calling for Habeck to resign. "The biggest problem is your grandiose idea of launching an unprecedented economic war against our most important energy supplier. The idea that we are punishing Putin by impoverishing millions of families in Germany and destroying our industry while Gazprom is making record profits. How stupid is that?" That is the best statement I've ever heard from a politician so far. With regards to this conflict. That is fantastic. Let me read that again, and I'm signing out. Let's see here. "The biggest problem is your grandiose idea of launching an unprecedented economic war against our most important energy supplier. The idea that we are punishing Putin by impoverishing millions of families in Germany and destroying our industry while Gazprom is making record profits. How stupid is that?" No further comments. TheDuran.locals.com. Check out Alexander's channel. Check out the Duran's channel. Rumble, ODYSEE, BitChute, Telegram, and Duran Shop. 10% off. 10% off. Use the code. Good day. Take care.